You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is about a killer mother-son duo who insists that they were framed. Now, when one disappearance leads to uncovering a crime spree, investigators realized that they had caught some of America's most dangerous criminals. And the most surprising part was, one had created the other. Then, after interviews, the public suddenly began questioning, were they really being framed? If you don't know, it's my absolute passion to tell these stories. I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so if that's something you'd like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed with the post notification bell on, giving this video a thumbs up, and leaving a nice comment down below. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1998 in New York, and Irene Silverman was 82 years old living in a Manhattan mansion. She had done very well for herself. She was living in this home worth almost $8 million. It was on Madison Avenue with an iron door and impenetrable security, and most of Irene's success had actually come from her determination from a very young age in whatever she was doing. You see, when she was younger, she had actually had to go to jazz bars with her father because he would often want to get drunk, and he would take her with him. And so she kind of learned street smarts, how to act around adults, how to get what she wanted even though she was quite young. Now, when her father actually abandoned the family, Irene and her mother moved to New York because they believed that she could make it huge in ballet. She wanted to be a rockette, and so they went there to get her into some training. Now, meanwhile, her mother did not have enough money to pay for the training, and especially not to live in New York, so she was actually working on the costumes for the ballet while Irene was working the ballet as well, and they were both bringing in money, but it still did not seem to be enough. She started fully supporting herself at the age of 16, and she described herself as this tough broad who knew all the street smarts and could survive in any situation. But by the time she was 25, she actually met and fell in love with this man who loved to watch her dance. There were a lot of men in the area who were wealthy who would come watch these ballerinas, and so she had met a lot of them, but this was the first time that she had feelings for one, and it was, of course, the same for him. And that is when she and this wealthy banker actually got married, and Irene could relax for the first time in her life. Her husband Sam became one of the wealthiest mortgage brokers in America, and they were doing very well. They had multiple homes in Athens, Honolulu, Paris, Manhattan, and they hosted so many parties, but the parties were more for Irene. She loved to have her wealthy and influential friends over, and she just loved to basically host and have these extravagant events that everybody would enjoy. Irene then turned their huge home in Manhattan into these luxury apartments that she would rent out for $6,000 a month to get one room, and there were so many famous people who stayed there, including Shaka Khan and Daniel Day-Lewis. When Irene was actually 59, she decided, she was not too old. She was going to go back to school. She was going to go to Columbia University. Now, she didn't even have her high school diploma. She didn't have any schooling because she had worked her entire childhood instead of going to school. But somehow she got accepted into Columbia University and started studying. And she would actually invite the classmates over for tea and wine, and everybody loved her, no matter if they were young or old or in between. They just absolutely adored Irene. Irene was friends with every neighbor on her block. This was the Upper East Side neighborhood, which was known to kind of be more for gossiping and basically too much drama to be friends. But Irene made sure that she actually made friends who were so protective over her that they would have done anything for her. In fact, Irene didn't leave her home without a friend or an employee because everybody wanted to make sure she was okay, wanted to go with her because no matter where she went, she brought the party. And nothing really did change when, after 39 years of marriage, Sam did pass away. Irene was, of course, upset, but she herself was a very independent lady and she knew she would be fine. 18 years later, Irene was thriving. She was holding a 4th of July party in 1998 as an 82-year-old. So for the 4th of July, she wasn't doing anything too big. She was having 2 friends over at this time, which was very small to her normal gatherings, but they were actually writing a biography for Irene. And so they wanted kind of a more intimate gathering. Now, Elva and Carol were the ones writing this, and they were almost like daughters to Irene. They really bonded with her and she was like a mentor to them. And so they were really excited to be able to hang out with her. And then the next day, Irene could not be located by any of her employees. By 4 p.m., they ended up calling the police, and due to her age, investigators right away were searching the area, calling different hospitals. Irene's friends who had dined with her the night before, who were Elva and Carol, were of course questioned because they were thought to be some of the last friends to see her. And they had a very interesting story to tell. They actually said that they felt impending danger that night at Irene's home, that they were eating, and then Irene kind of pointed to the monitor where her security cameras were, to the outside of the building where some of the apartment residents would come in through. And she was pointing at a man facing away from the camera that never showed his face. And Elva said she felt a very strong presence of evil the rest of the night and felt like they were being listened to. And Irene said it was actually one of her tenants, but didn't say much more. It was found, though, that a month prior, a man named Manny Guerra had showed up at Irene's apartment or home. Manny had told Irene he had heard her name from an insurance broker and really needed a place to stay. And Irene actually knew the insurance broker because he had given the name, and so she was kind of more comfortable with Manny. And so even though he didn't have any proof of identity at that moment, or any references or anything, he did have 1 month's rent of $6,000 cash in hand and ready to give to her. And so even though she kind of felt that instinct of maybe I shouldn't do this, she went ahead and allowed him to stay. She led him to 1B, gave him the keys, but it wasn't long until Irene began complaining about him to her friends. Irene claimed that Manny was very different than most of her tenants, and he actually wouldn't make eye contact with her. He was distant, he didn't want to talk to her, and the maids weren't allowed to go in and clean his apartment. There was also a patio that was attached to his apartment only that they wanted to water the plants for, but he wouldn't let them do so. And he would also be inviting lots of random people in, and there was always a middle-aged woman with him that Irene wasn't told about and wasn't told that she was going to be there a lot. This woman never showed her face on security camera, just like Manny didn't. She thought this was very strange, and so Irene actually decided to sketch a portrait of Manny because she had never gotten any photographs or anything of him, and he was staying in her home, so she sketched it out exactly what he looked like. Manny, at this time, it was weeks later, he still hadn't given his ID, and so eventually Irene told him that she was going to be giving him an eviction notice, that she could no longer house him if he wasn't giving her the proper paperwork. It became even more necessary when staff were telling Irene that they would find him lurking around her office, especially when she had guests. He would be listening in and they would ask him what he was doing and he would just kind of move along and not even answer. Irene, who is not an angry woman, started to get angry at him and started kind of flipping him off through the little peepholes that he was looking through and saying that the next stop he was going to have was jail. But none of this stopped. She began to believe that her home was being used for criminal activities, and everybody around her saw her moods shifting from this normally very relaxed, happy woman who was happy to have people in her home to this very angry, paranoid almost woman. And she wasn't scared, she was tough, but she was just upset. And all of this occurred within less than a month. A week before her disappearance, her friend noticed all of this and tried to ask her, but she said that she didn't want to tell him because she didn't want to put him in danger as well. While investigators were at this scene after she disappeared, they went to 1B, of course, to see Manny, to question him, but no one was inside. not Manny, not anybody else. And in fact, it was as though he didn't exist. There was no personal items inside that could link him to an actual human being. And even though they had zero footage of what Manny looked like, they did still have the sketch that Irene had made. They found that, and that is when everything changed, because one of the detectives looked at this and they immediately knew who this was. Now, this was not a man named Manny. It was a man named Kenny Kimes. Now, he knew Kenny because Kenny was already in custody because investigators had arrested Kenny and his mother Sante on fraud charges the same night that Irene disappeared. Now, when investigators arrested this mother and son duo on fraud charges, they had also found women's belongings on them. Now, they thought that this was just stolen and they weren't from a woman who had disappeared, because they hadn't yet linked the two. It turned out they had Irene's passports, checkbooks, social security cards, and old payroll stubs. And of course, now that this was coming together, this made them the prime suspect in Irene Silverman's disappearance. And while they were in custody, investigators actually searched for more clues as to where Irene had gone. They hadn't actually found a vehicle that the mother and son had been driving, but 2 days later, they found it. Now, inside of this car was automatic pistols, as well as a blank social security card, wigs in different colors, handcuffs, syringes with sedatives inside, a knife, and pepper spray. There were also more bits of evidence pointing to them being suspects in Irene's disappearance, because there was a piece of paper with Irene's signature all over, as though someone was trying to practice before forging it. There were also tons of cassettes with phone calls recorded onto it, and these were phone calls that were made by Irene. On the outside of the car, they found traces of blood and hair, but when they got this tested, it didn't belong to Irene, so they didn't think that that had anything to do with her. But they still had so much evidence against them. Since they had already searched Kenny's or Manny's apartment and found nothing, they wanted to search the location that his mother, Santi, was living in, and that is when they found that she was staying at the Plaza Hotel. Inside her room was a deed of ownership on Irene's house, transferring it from her to them, but it was actually going to this Atlantis Group Ltd., which of course didn't really exist and would have just gone to them, or so investigators believed. Now, through all of this, it was believed that Santi and Kenny were going to assume the identity of Irene and steal the rest of her wealth. However, both Santi and Kenny were begging investigators to listen to them, that they had nothing to do with the disappearance of this woman, this elderly lady vanishing. They both claimed that different investigators were planting evidence in order to frame them for something they didn't do, and so they put it inside the car. And Santi said the moment that they told investigators that they had stayed in Irene's apartments for a little bit, they honed in on them as suspects. She said it was a witch hunt, that they were only focusing on them, and the records showed that they were innocent. Yet this wasn't the first time that these two were thought to be involved in a murder. You see, in March of 1998, so only about 4 months prior, LAPD detectives, so all the way in Los Angeles instead of New York, had found a body near a dumpster near LAX, the Los Angeles airport. This man found was a man named David Kasdan, and he was thought to have just signed a loan for a home in Las Vegas. But they quickly found that this signature had been forged. When they got to this home, they found that it was partially burnt down and there was a homeless man inside. This homeless man said that the Kimes had told him to stay there to collect the insurance money. The police believed that the burning of the house was arson. Eventually, all of this led to a man named Stan, who actually confessed to giving the gun to Kenny that he would later kill David with. But Kenny and Sante were already on the move, and they hadn't been able to catch them until now, all the way in New York. You see, at the time that Irene vanished, investigators had learned about this Stan man, and it had actually been told by him that he had gotten a call from the Kimes saying that they needed him in New York. Now, the only reason he was telling investigators was because he was going to get off free if he helped them. Stan had met Sante at the hotel. Kenny arrived shortly after, and little did Kenny nor Sante know that the FBI were watching. But the FBI investigators were arresting them for a murder back in LA. They had no idea at this point that they were talking with Stan about buying the home of a woman who had just vanished mysteriously. When they were arrested, Kenny actually peed his pants. He was a 23-year-old man. Now, when investigators finally found their car while they were in custody, they were able to do so because it was a stolen rental car. And so inside they had found Irene's forged paperwork, and that is when they were able to connect them to Irene. But what I didn't tell you is that there were also 15 notebooks inside this car detailing mortgage fraud schemes of different victims. They had David Kasdan's body, who was found near the dumpster, but they still had no idea where Irene Silverman had gone. No matter how hard they searched, they had put up posters, they were talking about it on the media, and they were saying who had done this. They were saying that it was the Kimes. They were showing their mugshots, hoping that someone would see them and remember them and what they were doing with Irene. They were hoping that this could lead them to a possible site where she was being held or where she had been dumped, but no one was saying a thing. It turned out that Sante was from a family where her father worked as a laborer, and she was the third of 4 children. Now, when her father passed away, it left her mother to provide for the kids, and she became a sex worker to do so. Now, that is when they really became kind of more homeless. They were stealing for food, and due to that, the children were put into kind of a foster care system as it was at that time. Santi was adopted out by the Chambers family, who had a very loving environment. She became a really good student. She was a cheerleader. She was on the Glee Club. She got great grades. Then in high school, it appeared as though, to the first time to her adoptive parents, that she was kind of acting out. This wasn't like her, but she stole her father's credit card and went shopping. But she was also shoplifting, even though they had plenty of money. They were very well off, but she decided to steal lipsticks anyway. Now, close to graduation, Santi's mother actually tried to come back and be a part of her life, but Santi didn't want that. Yet there have been many stories that had come forward of people who knew Sante that say that whatever she says is a lie and that none of that actually happened. So nobody really knows what to believe about her past, but especially her younger sister has a lot to say about that time. Now, before they were put into foster care and adopted out, she claimed that they actually had a wonderful family. They struggled, but they were very loving. But one of the big things that they struggled with, along with being able to, provide enough food and a home, was that Santi had these horrible rages. They would happen daily. They were horrific. They were terrifying to everybody else. And it would be just because she would say that she wanted something, and then her family members or her parents would say no, and she would not take that. Now, these rages aren't like little tantrums. These were like full-blown, horrifying attacks. Her little sister said that she would actually torture her with fire. She would also hurt the animals in any way she could, and that there was a lot more going on as far as her wild side way before she was 16. She went on to marry her high school boyfriend due to the fact that she told him that she was pregnant, but they divorced after 3 months when he realized that she wasn't. Her next marriage, she would have her very first son, Kent. Now, this isn't Kenny, this is Kenny's older brother, Kent. It seemed as though every home that they would be in would go up in flames and they would get a huge sum of insurance money. 4 years after that marriage, that is when she was caught for shoplifting, and so her and her husband at that time divorced as well. Then 10 years later, she married another man named Kenneth Kimes. This would be the man she would have Kenny with, her second son. He was born in 1975, and nobody would have really thought that this woman had a huge criminal record, especially because she had 2 young boys. She had sons, she had a husband, she was the typical suburban mom. But on paper and to the criminal justice system, that was a complete lie. Along with being a murder suspect, Sante also had charges of shoplifting, forgery, larceny, forging credit cards, social security numbers, and passports. Her first conviction happened in 1985, 13 years prior to the murders of David and possibly of Irene. That is when Santi and her third husband, Kenneth, would be caught for enslaving women, forcing them to work and not paying them anything. She would go to the population of the homeless women there and she would tell them she was going to give them a better life. She would then take them into her home where she would torture them and tell them that They could not leave because they were illegal immigrants and she would turn them in. And so she was said to abuse them and torture them. But one of the maids eventually did escape and went to the FBI, and that's how they were caught. Santee was ultimately sentenced to 5 years in prison for slavery, whereas Kenneth only had to do alcohol treatment. Now, she was released those 5 years later, and not long after, her husband Kenneth passed away from a heart attack. Now, it was said that a young Kenny, a teenage Kenny, who was in high school, was doing well at this time. He had good friends, he was smart, and he had a good life. But when his mother came back, everything kind of changed. He stopped going to school. He went to a completely different school. He stopped hanging out with his friends due to his mother's request. And everything about him just kind of shifted. Then a year later, Santee and Kenny were actual suspects in an abduction of an heiress named Jacqueline Levetz, who had vanished from her home. Now, again, they were gone before they could be questioned in this, and when they were finally caught for, Irene's disappearance and David's murder, the FBI said there was actually nothing to connect them to Jacqueline's abduction, so those charges were dropped. Now at this time, Kenny was only 21 years old, but he had already started a criminal record as well. This was for resisting an officer, strong arm robbery, and battery. Santee was said to have 21 aliases during her entire period of crime, and one of which was the Dragon Lady. 3 years after Jacqueline's abduction, they were thought to murder David Kasdan and leave him by the dumpster after he figured out their plan. He had realized that they were basically forging signatures on loans for a house, and they were going to be exposed by him, but instead they killed him. They quickly moved to New York, where they had heard about this very wealthy widow, and that is when they thought that this elderly woman would be a good target because she was so vulnerable. But they didn't know how tough Irene Silverman was. Investigators who were talking to them said that they were the essence of evil, some of the most dangerous criminals in America. They had zero remorse or empathy and would do it again. Now, some believed that even more than money, they did it because they wanted power, and the media were even calling them Mommy and Clyde. In 1998, the Kimes were officially indicted on 84 charges. The trial was going to occur in New York, even though David's murder had happened in LA, but the judge called Santee a sociopath and the most degenerate defendant that had ever appeared in their courtroom. That is when everybody found out that in the murder of David Kasdan in LA, there was actually another accomplice. He testified because he was going to get off at a plea deal. And he said that Kenny shot David in the back of the head at his home, and then they all disposed of the evidence. He said the murder weapon was disassembled, put in the storm sewer, and that afterwards Kenny wanted to go and buy his mother flowers. Now, Kenny did decide to plead guilty during the trial, and this was something that kind of shocked everybody. Although he was still saying that he was innocent, he was kind of taking on the approach that his mother had forced him to do everything. And this was when he said that he had strangled Irene after his mother used a stun gun on her. Then he stuffed her into a bag and dumped her near a dumpster in New Jersey. Then he confessed that there was another victim, and this was 2 years prior to David and Irene's murders, and this was in the Bahamas. It was said to be in 1996. They met a banker named Saeed Bilal Ahmed, who denied them a loan, and his mother got very angry, and they both drugged him before drowning him in the bathtub and dumping his body. That same year, a man named Elmer Holmgreen vanished, and this was after Elmer had told investigators about the Kimes and the fact that they asked him to help burn down their house in Hawaii for insurance. Now, while he was saying that his mother forced him to do all of this, Santee was saying that she never murdered anyone either. She said the only reason her son was saying any of that crazy nonsense was because he didn't want the death penalty for them, because their trial was combined. She yelled out in court that it was like the Salem witch trials and they were murdering the Constitution. Kenny was believed to be a remorseless predator, the same way his mother was believed to be a manipulative sociopath. They were found guilty of 117 charges, which meant Santee was sentenced to life plus 125 years, and Kenny was sentenced to life plus 124 years. The next year, in 1999, Kenny and Santee were interviewed together. This was for 60 minutes, and they held hands throughout the entire interview. Santee said she was just an average mom. Kenny said that his mother was beautiful, not only spiritually and intellectually, but physically as well. When the interviewer asked about the fact that Kenny kind of got an A in acting class, and they were kind of, trying to get out of him that he was a good actor, that's when their lawyers ripped off the microphones and they walked out of the interview. And then in 2000, Kenny was being interviewed again, and this was inside the jail, when suddenly he brought out a ballpoint pen and put it to the throat of the interviewer holding her hostage. He said he would let her go if his mother was not extradited to California. They were trying to get them both to California to try them for David's murder and to get them the death penalty. And he said he would let her go if his mother stayed there. 4 hours later, with this happening, pure chaos, trying to save this hostage, they finally got Kenny's attention away. He was distracted and they tackled him to the ground. She survived.
With the duo facing extradition to California to face additional murder charges, Kimes agreed to a jailhouse interview with Court TV producer Maria Zone.
And he sat down and I said to myself, he looks pretty mean. But I'm not going to say anything because I have a lot of ground to cover. I have a lot of questions to ask him.
Are you saying, though, that Mrs. Silverman was aware that you were sharing the apartment with your mother?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But after 15 minutes, Kenneth Kimes had a question of his own.
Could, if I may ask, could we take a break in maybe 5 or 10 minutes?
How about 2 minutes?
Sure. Better.
What do you need a break for?
Or just put a little water on my face.
Just moments after the camera was turned off, Kimes took Zone hostage.
2 handcuffs, 1 blanket. Back! Cameraman, back!
Kimes was holding this pen to Zone's throat. What followed was a tense standoff with Zone's life in the balance.
In my mind, I'm thinking about the things that he's done and the things that I've read that he's done and the fact that he's been convicted of murder. And at this point, I'm really, really scared. It was very terrifying, and it was a situation that you never think you're going to be in yourself.
The next year, they were both sent to California, and Santee continued to plead not guilty, and they were both sentenced to life in prison once again. Santee was then interviewed by Larry King, where she said that she knew she was going to get her justice. She said there was no crime. They never even found Irene, and she claimed it was actually a premeditated murder of her son Kenny due to the wrongful conviction of him.
This is a premeditated murder of my own son who has done nothing. They had no crime, Larry. They made
Well, they have a missing person.
Yes, they have a missing person.
And so in a missing person, you suspect a crime, don't you? I mean, if you were a police officer and someone's missing and you don't find them, you suspect someone did something to them. If something happened to them themselves, you'd find them.
You suspect, and I'm glad you asked me that, because then you find evidence. And there is no evidence. They have no evidence. They had no body, no reliable evidence, no witnesses.
Weren't cards found on you and your son that belonged to her, things that belonged to her?
No.
Then how did they connect the two?
All of those things, and what I was going to ask you, please, and I ask the world, people who believe in justice, before we couldn't get our teeth into anything and prove what was being done, but after we lost in the lower trial, now things are of record. And if agencies or people who believe in justice will just read the transcripts, they'll see exactly what happened. They don't have to, you don't have to believe us.
She said that they never even rented the apartment from Irene, that Irene was just their friend and they stayed there every once in a while. And she was begging Larry to read all the transcripts of the cases, saying that the real truth was inside. Now, what I heard from that interview is that when Larry was kind of asking her the hard-hitting questions, she would start with saying, "Oh, I'm so glad you asked me that question," and go back to the fact that all of the evidence was planted against them. She denied all of her prior convictions, giving excuses to all of them, and she said the only regret that she has is trusting the wrong people. Santee said that in the UK, the media, the public, is labeling this the worst injustice in America, the worst mistake, convicting the two of them.
You personally never did anything to your knowledge that was wrong?
Oh, no, I would never say that. I was homeless. When I was a little girl, I was running around the streets of Los Angeles trying to feed myself, so I stole things like cheese or something like that. I then was rescued and adopted. I married a fantastically wealthy man. His first relatives hated me and are right now trying to destroy me, all over money. But I have made mistakes, but nothing that is really heinous
so
or bad.
So the obvious question is, why you?
Okay.
All right, why are they going to pick, why you and your son? I mean, they have a missing lady who's quite aged,
yes.
Right?
Yes.
Why you?
Because we just happened to be there at the apartment.
She said that during the trial, she was not allowed to testify, and that the judge only allowed jurors who believed that someone could be guilty even without a body. She said the judge also allowed gossip and rumors into the trial as fact. Now, when she was asked about the fact that there have been lots of rumors about incest between Kenny and herself, she said that she wasn't even going to talk about it because it's gross and she just doesn't need to answer it. But she did say she believed that the only reason she's still alive is to prove Kenny's innocence. After this interview, many thought that she was the greatest con artist alive and the greatest liar they had ever seen. When Larry King interviewed Kenny, he said almost the exact same things as his mother, that he didn't want to plead guilty, but that in order to make sure that they didn't get the death penalty, that's what he had to do, and blame his mother and himself. He was almost smug during parts, laughing while answering some of the questions, winking and smiling, and he said that he had no prior criminal record and a very good life.
Where were you on the day this supposedly happened?
The Hilton. The cell phone records. There are cell phone records that prove we were not even in the apartment.
You were staying at the Hilton in New York?
No, we were not even in the apartment.
You were at the Hilton?
Yeah, I was at the Hilton.
As a guest?
No.
Just there?
It was July 5th. As you know, as a Manhattan resident, July 5th is a happening day for street fairs and all kinds of fun activities. We were out having a normal day. And
you made calls from the cell phone?
That would prove that at all times we were not even there.
Many could tell he was just as good of a con artist as his mother. She had either taught him well, or he had simply grown up to be just like her. He then said that they were each other's world. Now in 2014, Sante actually died while in prison, and after this, Kenny came forward to be interviewed once again, and he had a very cautionary tale that he wanted to tell. One that started with his mother teaching him to kill. Now, he officially confessed to killing with his mother's help at this point. He said his hands were around Irene's neck, and he felt electricity pulsing through her when he strangled the life out of her. He said he was terrified, but he kept his hands around his throat. He wanted to run, but he stayed committed. He then said a dead Irene was very fragile. He said he then listened to his mother telling him what to do because her tone reminded him of when he was a child. He said, "Kenny, get to bed. Kenny, brush your teeth. Kenny, put the body in the effing duffel bag." He said he had finally escaped this childhood abuse by going to college, or about to go to college during this high school time, and he found out that his father had died suddenly. He then realized his mother was out of prison and she hadn't told him for 2 months that his father had died. He said he always suspected her in his death, but Sante then asked him to help collect the money that her husband was keeping in the Bahamas, and that is where the first murder would occur. Saeed Ahmed was suspicious of the accounts, and she decided he had to go. He said his mother would let him know when it was time for someone else to die, and he always obeyed. He claimed he never wanted to confess, especially against his mother, but she wasn't going to confess even if it meant she would get the death penalty, so he did it for the both of them. After he did confess, though, he said he wrote in her journal, "Tattletale, tattletale, too bad you're going straight to hell. I am no longer the son who will do anything for his mother, but I'm still a murderer. Only now I get to live. I am the narc who escaped the needle, the piece of who doesn't get to walk the green mile. Just spent the last 10 minutes vomiting. I ratted my mom out. If I didn't, we would both go to death row. Now we get to live. I feel dead already. God have mercy on us. No one else will. He had then begun writing with a writer named Tracy Faust, who he had become pen pals with. Now, they allegedly fell in love after this, and Kenny went on to say that prison didn't reform him, that love did. Now, Kenny remains in prison today, and his lover has passed away since then. But Kenny's older brother, Kent, has since written a book about his family called Son of a Grifter. And he said that he immediately knew that his family was involved when he heard about David Kasdan's murder, because they actually knew him. He was a family friend, and he started connecting the dots. He said he had met a lot of good liars in his day, but never as good as his mother. He said that Sante was as evil could get, or as loving could get. Whatever she wanted you to feel about her, you would feel it. He also said that one of their childhood homes was burnt to the ground. Like I said, many of them were. But on this particular one, she had actually asked him to run back in and grab her a notebook, I think it was, and it blew up in his face, almost killing him.
Yeah, I was about 7 years old, and Mom asked me to go upstairs and grab a folder for her. And I did, and I come running down the stairs, and right when I got to the front door, the house blew up, and I was thrown into the front yard and had the wind knocked out of me, bruised up pretty good, and probably the first arson I guess I participated in with my mother.
But also, she had just sent you into that house where she knew a bomb was about to go off. She'd set the bomb.
Well, it's a good example of what she's like. I don't think that she wanted her son killed, but I think what it was is that there was a situation at hand. She had to make a decision right there, and I was the only tool available to her. And she might have thought it'd be faster for me to do it. She might have thought it might be less risk to her. I don't think so, but I wrestled with that one for a few years.
I think in the next paragraph you write how fiercely she loved you, this mother who sent her 7-year-old son into a house that she knew was about to blow up.
I'm not sure she knew that house was going to blow up. I know that house was meant to burn, but she wasn't very good at her trade of arson. She either used too much stuff or not enough usually. And I remember she was pretty emotional. I know it surprised her.
He said he would also be used as a distraction in shoplifting schemes, and he would do so because he didn't know any better. But as he got to his teenage years, he began to realize how horrific his mother was. But he stayed because he knew his little brother needed protecting. Later on, he said he helped a few of the maids escape who were being enslaved.
But the only requirement for the maids, that they be naive and that they would be illegal aliens, and she'd get them, talk them in, the ultimate sale, live in a fancy home and be part of this big family, and, never paid any of them. But that was an agreement. They all knew that they weren't going to get paid, as far as I know, when they first came to work for us. But they had no idea what was in store for them.
And what was in store for them?
First, she had the honeymoon where everything was wonderful. Mom buying them little gifts. They were called the daughter she never had. Then the transition, where she would ask them to do more and more. And then the final round, where she was just downright mean to them, where obsessive with clean. I remember as a kid having to scrub the patios out with disinfectant. My hands were raw. And I started bulking at that job, so she got the maids to do stuff like that. I remember walking into our garage, and the ammonia was so strong I thought I was going to pass out, and the two of the maids were still in there, and they wanted to come out and get fresh air. Mom wouldn't let them do it because that floor had to be disinfected. And so we had pretty healthy cars, I guess.
Would she beat them?
I saw 2 acts of violence while I was there. And a lot of the accusations I never was there to witness. But from what I've read and depositions from that case, I guess she was very, very violent with him.
Kent said he actually never went to the trial for any of the murders because he was afraid that they were going to get away with it. He said he knew his brother Kenny was capable of murder because Kent had once stopped him from strangling their mother with a rope. Now that's interesting to me, as devoted as he was to his mother, as manipulated as he was by his mother, that he had once tried to kill her. It's interesting to me, was that when he was much younger? Was that before the manipulation really started? Or did he snap out of it at one point and want to be free of her? I'd love to know really more of the story behind that. But many still believe that the ultimate con in this case is that Sante was able to convince herself and Kenny that they did nothing wrong, and they believed it. Do you believe that Kenny was manipulated into doing everything that his mother said? Or was he doing this of his own free will and was possibly a sociopath, as his mother was dubbed? It's a very interesting one because although he confessed against her, that didn't necessarily mean that he was happy he was free from her, because he states multiple times that he didn't want to do that. He was actually saving his mother by admitting their guilt and blaming her, because if he hadn't, they would have gone on death row. Do you believe in any way that the crimes were being framed? Sante, to her very last day, preached about this, saying that there was no way that this actually occurred, that they actually did this, that the investigators wanted someone to blame, and they were the first ones available. Do you think that that is true? Do you think there's any hint of truth in that? We know that, the criminal justice system is not perfect by any means. We know that there are many corrupt investigators. But is that what happened here? Let me know down below. But don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces.